Well, hello everybody. I guess finally I'm back. Sorry about the delay of several weeks, if not maybe a month and a half. I have had a lot of things going on. Went overseas a couple times. Had to deal with school, had to do work, and met a girl. She's great, even though at this point she might dump me. We shall see. Anyways, so this is going to be a replay, or much rather actually a set of replays for the American Tier 9 Heavy Tanks, the M103. And of course, this is going to be World of Tanks. Arguably, you can say that, my method is going to be quick and dirty in showing how the tanks work and how you will perform. There's no detailed analysis or garage reviews, but it should give you a general idea and keep you reasonably entertained, if you will. So the M103 is considered essentially the only heavy tank the United States Army has ever fielded in relatively large numbers. It wasn't a testing platform or a prototype, if you will, like the T-29 or the T-32 or the M6 or the T-1. This was a legit standard issue vehicle. Of course, it never saw battle. It was in Korea or Vietnam or never got exported to any one of the allies or partners. But still, being a standard issue piece of equipment, it's quite a big deal. So how does it perform in the game? From my perspective, I would say that the M103 is a bit of a mixed bag. It's not a bad tank, but at the end of the day, it's not all rainbows and butterflies. Some people, such as Jingles, will probably say that the M103 is actually a fairly decent heavy tank. I guess to an extent, I would disagree. So. Why is that? Let's get down to the details and talk about the pluses and minuses regarding the tank. So here are the pluses. The gun is decent. It handles okay. It's not great, but it's fairly okay. Penetration's good. Bloom is okay. DPM is not too bad. Accuracy is not too bad. In terms of armor, the turret should be able to allow you to bully lower tier tanks no problem. Tier 7, tier 8s. The turret for the most part will work against tier 7 and tier 8s. The hull is not too bad. The lower plate unfortunately can still be panned by most tier 8s and some tier 7s. The upper plate, on the other hand, is actually reliable or semi-reliable against even tier tank guns. But technically speaking, the biggest problem with the M103's armor scheme is the fact that it kind of relies on angles and slopes and these funky shapes to work, instead of consistent thickness, as you'll see on tank like the E100 or Mouse. So there's always a degree of uncertainty and RNG to it. That means, sometimes you'll probably bounce maybe a 1 in 3 or JP 100, but then you will get panned by tier 8 the next shot. Another problem with the M103 is the fact that, its armor very much relies on the manipulation and control of the tank's directionality and position to work. You can argue that that applies to every single tank there is, but to be honest, not that simple in a sense that even though from the front, the turret of the M103 is effective against most tier 7s, tier 8s, and the upper plates against essentially everything it sees, except maybe some tank destroyers and gold spammers. If your tank is showing people your side, if you even over angle slightly, or if your turret is turned to the side even by a little bit, then you are essentially very much vulnerable. Because not only the side profile of the tank is huge, but the side armor is also fairly inconsistent and relatively thin. For example, if your turret's kind of off the front axis by an easy 20 or 30 degree, your turret cheek can essentially be penetrated by many tier 8s, if you will. And the worst part of the M103 is the fact that, the side of the holes, assuming the enemy does not hit the tracks, is only 44mm, which means, any enemy weapons beyond the 150mm in caliber can effectively triple overmatch and effectively auto-pan your sides. That applies to JPE 100s, FV 183s, ISU 152s, the 704, you name it. Essentially most of the tank destroyers from tier 8s and above. And the worst thing about it is the fact that, the side of the tank is very much made of ammo racks as well as fuel tanks. And unfortunately for an American tank of this era, they still use a gasoline engine, which means, in game they have a 20% fire chance. So that means shots to the side not only will damage your modules, but will essentially cause you to burn very easily. And obviously that whole reality is made worse with the triple overmatch mechanism I mentioned. And if anything, probably the worst thing about that, as well as the mediocre side armor in general, is the fact that, artillery, whether they're shooting AP Gold or HE Splash, will essentially very much render the tank very vulnerable. Even a lower tier artillery, like a tier 8 or tier 7, can easily hit the relatively huge and thin side of the M103 and roll very high. So it's very important to stay artillery safe. It's not artillery resistant like IS-7 or T-10, unfortunately. Arguably, another unfortunate thing about M103 is the fact that, from my perspective, the combination of DPM, ROF, and Alpha of this tank doesn't really suit any particular playstyle. It's not exactly a DPM platform. It's not a 113 or a E5 or a FE215. Those tanks have moderately good alpha, but they reload fast enough to for the damage to add up. And practically speaking, the reload is fast enough for you to essentially out DPM and out trade enemies with give or take a 10-second reload. Tanks like the IS-3, T-10, IS-7. You can argue the E-100 with the 128mm. To a lesser extent, the E-75. If the reload was faster, just by maybe a second, you can probably fire out 2 shots for every one those enemies may fire. But because of my effective 9-second reload, it just simply doesn't cut it. But on the other hand, if you try to peekaboo with this tank and try to essentially out-alpha the enemy for a tier 9, it also doesn't work. Sure, 400 alpha for a tier 8, it's very respectable, as you can see with the T-34, but for tier 9, it's mediocre. And as with the format of previous videos, I will show the results in the end, but we shall look at the replays first. So here's the second replay. So just to sum up, I guess both these replays are Ace Tanker replays, but they kind of do play out differently. Especially, I do believe the damage count for the second game is quite mediocre. Perhaps it shows that, this game occurred during a period in which people weren't doing so well in this tank, so to speak. But still, it shows, how this thing works and how this thing doesn't. So, this time I'm top tier. We are in the new or relatively new check map. Being a top tier heavy, I will probably go to the western side of the map and try to brawl and push the corridor. because despite the lack of the reliability with my armor, it's still reasonably good compared to a lower tier tank or a medium tank. And of course, for those guys, it's probably much better for them to exploit their weapons handling or camo or mobility on the more open eastern side of the map. Meanwhile, vice versa, I probably want to avoid the open side of the map as to prevent being hit by artillery and TDs, which will obviously out DPM and out alpha me and are essentially better at sniping than I am from long distance.
Penetration.
So right now I'm effectively side scraping with 103. It's not the best of things to do, but I do believe I'm only facing a T-29 with a 105mm, so that means he's not going to triple overmatch my sides. And luckily, because the tracks in the 103 are relatively wide, so if you angle carefully, there's a good chance the enemy is going to hit your track rather than the side of your hull without hitting the track module first. That mechanism, in a sense, probably negates the triple overmatch mechanism to an extent, and it helps. And as you can see, the M103 moves around okay. From my perspective, I'll say that it's probably marginally faster than E100 or Tiger II, and from my perspective, it feels about as fast as the E75, which is disappointing because the E75 has far better armor.
Enemy armor is damaged.
But then, maybe that's not a fair comparison because my E75 has a 4-skill crew versus the 2-skill crew I have in the 103. But for people who claim that the 103 can be played like a giant medium tank, I think, perhaps that's a bit of an exaggeration. Especially if,
we've lost a track.
If the person in question
Enemy armor is damaged.
is used to Chinese and Russian mediums.
We fixed the track. Get
Perhaps
going.
if you talk about like
Penetration.
British mediums or American mediums like the M48 or the Centurion, perhaps the M103 is not much slower, but at the end of the day, this thing is not a T54 or T44 or T62A or T43, you name
Armor
it.
is destroyed.
It's way clumsier, way slower. And in a sense, the clumsiness kind of limits your ability to utilize your armor, just simply because sometimes you couldn't maneuver and turn and angle and adjust your position quick enough to prevent the enemy from going through a relatively vulnerable part of your armor scheme from an undesirable angle, if you will. And I have just seen the T-30, and luckily I killed him. But the T-30 is probably a huge nemesis for the M103 because, on practical terms, the T-30 essentially trades perhaps the slight mobility advantage of the M103 as well as the better upper plate armor for significantly more alpha. And you can almost argue that turret for the T-30 is more durable than the turret for the M103 because it has a smaller, harder to hit commander's hatch, as well as it's probably more resistant to the damage when the enemy is off axis from the front of your turret. But I guess you can argue that T-30 is even clumsier and it has a relatively poor ROF and DPM. So you gotta be careful and pace yourself and take your chances, unfortunately.
Enemy armor is destroyed.
And as you can see, peek booming as well as snap shooting the enemy, it's not the most advisable thing to do in the M103 because the bloom situation on the tank is, I would say, mediocre at best. It's not terrible, it's not a KV2, but for a moderate alpha, a high penetration weapon, it's not great. You can argue that the British version of this weapon, the Conqueror, is significantly better in that regard. Meanwhile, a lot of people will complain about how the 130mm on the Chinese WZ 11114 or the 122mm on the T10 are derpier and inferior, but to be honest, with the appropriate upgrades or equipment, as well as the proper crew training, I actually do not think those weapons are worse than this 120mm on the 103 at all. So you can argue that's a bit of a stereotype. And as you can see, I had to just kill the T-32, which is essentially the tank that came before the 103. And unfortunately I had to push out far enough to hit his hull, because the T-32 arguably has a stronger and harder to hit and smaller turret than the 103. And most importantly, the T-32's turret lacks the commander's hatch you see on the 103, which is a major weak spot. Arguably a weak spot that's so weak that Tier 7s can hit no problem.
We fixed the track. Get going.
Well, Tier 7 can not only hit it, but also penetrate it, if you will. Another thing you can see right now is that, I can utilize my depression fairly decently. I can kind of cross the ridge, but still have enough depression to shoot down from it. And that's something you cannot do on something like a T10. Well, first game was actually my very first ace tanker game in the 103. I got steel wall as well as high caliber, decent profit without a premium account, a little over 5k damage and first on the team. In a sense, you can argue that I kind of lucked out because the team was relatively aggressive and the enemy didn't have a chance to hit me, partly because my allies were aggressive enough to expose themselves and take the fire away from the enemies. The second game was relatively smartly played and mellow and low-key. Not nearly as much damage, but I still have done enough. But this goes to show that, once again, consistency matters. Essentially much more than, dumb luck and freak accidents, if you will. Anyways, thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe and show people my channel. And, thanks to the holidays, hopefully I'll have more videos up soon. But for now, thanks for watching.